The Australian Financial Review.
Hello, I'm Anthony Macdonald, Chanticleer columnist at the AFR. Welcome to our weekly news breakdown of all things business, finance and markets. With me today, for the first time, is the big boss who's not afraid of the bond vigilantes. It's the AFR's Editor-in-Chief, James Chessell. How are you, James?
I'm well, Ant. A strange combination of capitulation and liberation.
This week, we're going to relive one of the most action-packed weeks we've seen in financial markets, courtesy of Donald Trump and his tariffs back down. We're going to discuss whether Peter Dutton has a chance to make a comeback in Australia's election polls and look ahead to another big week for corporate Australia. But James, firstly, it's great to have you back on the Chook podcast. It's our first time together. You're filling in for James Thompson. You've got huge boots to fill. Have you been practicing a few fantastics?
I was, but in all respect to James, who I hope is having a well-deserved break, but I just think it's not the right catchphrase for this week. I've been practicing my wows and my oh my gods. It hasn't been fantastic. It's been more worrying, I think.
Oh, it's been a hectic ride, hasn't it? Well, welcome back, James. Let's start by chewing over a few corporate stories. It was another bad week for the ASX this week, and I'm talking about the exchange operator rather than the market itself. The AFR revealed this week that the Reserve Bank of Australia warned the ASX it had lost confidence in the exchange's ability to manage critical market infrastructure late last year and had an entrenched culture that approached recommendations to resolve risk-related issues as reaction and narrow compliance exercises. James, these were scathing words from the RBA. Now, you put the story on the front page. What did you make of the criticism? Was it fair or unfair?
I think it was fair, which is why we gave the story such a prominent run. Can I just take you on a little bit of a walk down memory lane with the ASX? Because I think this leads back to your question. And you and I are both old enough to know that this is meant to be a really important company, as young people would say. There's meant to be a bit of an aura about the ASX. Because it is our exchange. It was demutualised in 1987. It used to be controlled and owned by the stockbroking firms that used it. And it was also the first major exchange in the world to list its own securities on the exchange that it operates. But since then, and more recently, I guess, it's had a lot of technology problems and there's been outages. And the thing that an exchange needs to do is it needs to have confidence in its participants and it needs to be transparent in the way it deals with the participants. And on both counts, I think the ASX has fallen short. And what the RBA said is pretty unprecedented. That, you know, they don't normally give institutions a whack like this, but as they point out, it's a critical piece of financial markets infrastructure. So for it not to be functioning properly, these issues are well known. They've been trying to fix them for a while, I think is really worrying and a source, frankly, of embarrassment for Australia as a country that normally does this kind of stuff well.
Good point.
Well, Anthony, there's really nowhere else to start for our first topic than Donald Trump's tariff madness. Trump's reciprocal tariff plan and escalating trade war with China had financial markets on edge all week, creating the most volatile trading conditions since the pandemic. The week started with a huge amount of uncertainty following Liberation Day, which was Thursday last week. Seems like a lifetime ago. And then huge losses on the ASX. Our market opened about 6% down Monday morning as investors fretted about the prospect of a US recession, the Fed Reserve's inability or unwillingness to do anything about it, and the prospects of a sweeping trade war. Markets kept rumbling through Tuesday and Wednesday, and by Wednesday night, I think we'd reached boiling point. As Bell Potter's redoubtable Richard Copleston said, he went to bed that night thinking the market was at a crossroads. It would either fall 20% or recover 10%. And what was Coppo talking about? Why was everyone so on edge?
James, I'm going to give you some credit here. You came to me on Wednesday morning and said this sell-off's starting to look a bit leaky. It had all been a bit orderly and it was starting to look a bit leaky. People were thinking about the plumbing of the financial system and it had really sort of gone up to the next level. And look, you were right. So it had been a hugely eventful 6 or 7 days since Liberation Day, but it was a pretty ordinary type of sell-off. It was a sell-off that was based around the growth. People thought the US economy wasn't going to grow as fast as they previously expected. So shares had been sold. They were down sort of 15% as everyone sold assets, retreated to higher ground. Like valuations had been elevated and everyone wanted to sort of get back to more reasonable settings. But James, on Tuesday night in the US, bond markets started jumping around. And by jumping around, I mean investors were dumping US treasuries, which sends the price down, sends the yield up. And that yield jumped from about 4 to 4.5% pretty quickly, which is a huge move. Now, James, this caught everyone by surprise. Usually, US bonds are a safe haven. So when there's a growth shock and people start selling equities, normally they buy US government bonds. When scary stuff happens, even if it's to do with the US, they buy government bonds because that's like the safe ground. And it's been like that for decades, James. Like now, we had a situation where the scary stuff was happening and people were selling equities, but they were also selling the US government bonds, right? And that drives the capital value down. So investors are recording losses on them and the yield's up, which forces up the government's cost of borrowing. Now, James, that was Tuesday night in the US, continued through Wednesday in Asia trade. That's when you came around and said things are starting to look a bit leaky. And by the end of it, like on Wednesday afternoon in Australia, you read all the desk notes coming out of the brokers and they're all starting to question whether the US has lost its safe haven status in markets. We're talking about something monumental there. That is like the bedrock of markets, has been for decades. So shares were tanking. They're a big part of the story too, but we see it time and time again, James. It's when these things get to bond markets.
Yep.
That's when there's big action, right? Bonds is where the governments raise money. It's where the central banks play. It's where the risk-free rate's set that determines the price of assets everywhere else. So yeah, James, by Wednesday night our time, all this speculation swirling about bonds, whether bonds have lost their safe haven status. At the same time, the US government was in the market trying to raise money for new bonds, 10 and 30-year bonds. It needs investors to trust the government, trust its balance sheet. There's all this speculation and rumors flying around about who's selling bonds and why. Like, is China selling bonds to...
The Japanese.
The Japanese. Is that all these people selling bonds to put pressure back on Trump? So bond markets were focused on the inflation shock. They're selling. Equity markets were focused on the growth shock, so they're selling. Put the two together, James, and you've got a serious problem. Questions about the financial system. And by Wednesday night, it all just got too much, right?
And he blinked, right?
And he blinked. So you see, Jamie Dimon go on Fox News and say, the tariffs will likely cause a recession. You see these prominent investors, Bill Ackman, for example, on Twitter talking about Trump needs to make changes. He needs to get rid of these big reciprocal tariffs. And sure enough, he blinked, right? He put out there on social media that the market was looking cheap. And then an hour or so later, he walked back from the tariffs. And the reason he did it, James, was just all this pressure. Now, in the wash-up, the supporters all come out and say he's just playing the art of the deal, right? And maybe he was. He's got 75 countries that now want to do trade deals with him, allegedly. But
I think his expression was kiss his ass.
but you can't deny there was all this pressure
Yeah.
from financial markets, from the business world. Now, James, so Trump's back down now after taking us all on this insane ride in the past week. Does that come without cost? Like, do you think that there's a credibility issue here that sort of now lingers over Trump, over the US, over the tariffs, over the financial markets, that could emerge as sort of like the actual problem?
I think there's a pretty obvious cost here. And the bit I'd pick out of your really good summary there is that, and the reason we care about bonds so much is that they're meant to be a safe haven asset. They're symbolically important. And Trump and his chief economic advisor were happy to cop a bit of short-term pain on the equity side, but if the market is an iceberg, the bonds are the 90% that sit below the surface that sink ocean liners. And that's what caused him to move when as you said, things started getting out of whack. Trump would obviously say that he now has everyone where he wants them. He's got a whole bunch of countries with a baseline 10% tariff applied to them that want to negotiate. And at last count, he's got China at 145%, which is a terrifying number, but, he would say he's in a stronger position. But it's hard to see a way through this where everyone doesn't get hurt. At the end of the day, Trump retains this long-held conviction that tariffs are a powerful weapon to ensure that manufacturing jobs return to America. But the trouble with that theory is that if he really wants companies to be persuaded to return back to America, to literally set up factories onshore, he's going to have to keep these tariffs up for a while. If he does it in the short term, there's no incentive for companies to do that.
Yeah.
But if he keeps them high for longer, what incentives do trading partners have to give concessions in these negotiations that are coming up? So there's this paradox at the heart of this that I think will be really hard for him to resolve. And then you get to the other big outstanding issue, which is China. Look, choose whatever bad metaphor you want. We've liked the game of chicken one. Yeah. But you've got two big gorillas engaged in the world's most expensive ever game of Blink. How do you think that's going to play out?
China must be sitting there going, WTF, Trump. Like, seriously, what are you doing? You're a huge buyer of all our crap. You're taxing your own people to buy it from us. And you're doing it so fast that companies don't have time to rewire their supply chains. And you're wanting to onshore manufacturing and all these other low-level industries. Americans have not been interested in working in factories. Your share market trades at 25 times forward earnings because you've changed to this like capital light tech global businesses. Yet you want to try and like industrialize the whole thing again and focus on what are normally less valuable things. So it's bad for the equity market. So, I mean, they must be really scratching their head, I think, James. And anyway, the US keeps upping the tariffs on the Chinese imports and China keeps upping them on the US. Like you said, it's up to 145% now. China retaliated. I think they're at 84%. And they blacklisted a bunch of American companies as well. The WTO has warned it could slash China-US trade by as much as 80%. So have a huge potential impact on the global economy. Interestingly, James, if you're looking at the US and effective tariffs, even after the back down on the reciprocal tariffs, the economists reckon that the US will be paying effectively about 25 to 30% on imports now anyway, because they get so much from China. So the inflationary impact is still there, like in a big, big way. Yep. That's going to hit the economy in the near term. But in terms of what's going to happen, like markets, and particularly after this week where we saw the back down on an announcement that was made only a week earlier, they're hoping that there's going to be some big grand deal, like a whopper, like both big dogs in the room, work out the trade, no more 145% tariffs, no more 84% tariffs. They can tax each other to some extent, but not those extents. The US can kick and scream about Chinese stealing IP. China can fight for some of their causes, but basically they can work it all out. And is that going to happen? Like, who knows after this week, James? Like, I'm sure Trump would say never ever, but he would have said never ever about the reciprocal tariffs last week as well. And it just took 1 week's volatility and market pressure to change his mind. But I mean, the thing about Trump, James, is that he seems to have a really long memory. And if you think about what cost him the election last time around in 2020 when he lost to Joe Biden, he had the economy firing, he had markets firing, everything was looking good. And then COVID came around, right? And probably cost him the presidency.
But he's in danger, you mentioned this before, of stoking inflation again, which has been this wrecking ball for incumbent governments across the world. I think the battle between China and America is really interesting this time round. In 2024, China's exports to America were worth $439 billion US, compared with $144 billion US for its imports from the US. So in theory, China has a lot more to lose in this game of chicken. However, one of our reporters, Jess Sire, who's based in Asia and covers China, had a good chat with Jeff Raby, who's a former ambassador for Australia in Beijing. And he made the point that, China's better prepared this time. There'll be a lot of fiscal pump priming and monetary easing that will ease the pain for the Chinese economy. He also made the point that China has laid the groundwork for a diversified trade base. It's a lot more advanced now than it was, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. He made the point that they do business with every other country in the world. And even with this tariff pause, Trump has broken trust with all of them. So I'm not saying it's a level playing field. I'm not saying China will emerge from this triumphant, but they have an equally headstrong leader, and he's going to push really, really hard. And they do have more tools at their disposal, I think, in this case. So it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think despite a week of madness, I mean, the one thing that I think is in America's favour, and I'm not saying they've won the week, by the way, but I think the one thing that they do have in their favour is at least now Trump's supposedly got 75 countries at the table willing to negotiate with them, right? And as part of those negotiations, you can imagine that US is going to try and make sure it comes out ahead of where China would with the same countries in those negotiations. So at least it's got people at the table. But as we stand, James, we've got a 90-day reprieve on those reciprocal tariffs, the big ones that were announced in the Rose Garden last week. What do you think happens in the coming 90 days? Do you think the reciprocal tariffs, the whole notion, of 30, 40, 50% plus tariffs, do you think that's gone for good?
No, I don't. I think he's stuck because of that paradox that I mentioned before. That's not to say he won't do deals with certain countries, but in a lot of cases, some of the markers that he's put out are immovable. So in the case of Australia, beef has been one of the key grievances for the US. We have some biological controls that means we don't really import US beef. And I can't see the government changing or shifting on that. They've certainly said they're not going to shift on that. It would probably be unpopular with the agricultural sector, which is a pretty powerful political force in this country. So what do we give? You said the art of the deal. That's absolutely the way that he is playing this. But what do we give him? The government's talked about critical minerals as a bit of a bargaining chip. I'm not sure that's going to cut it. So everyone's breathing a sigh of relief after Wednesday, but, we're sitting here, our market's down 2%. The market in the US was down overnight. I think realisation is dawning that this trade situation will not be unravelled cleanly, and that for Trump to be a winner with all these 75 different countries, they might have to give him something they just don't want to give.
Just quickly, what do you think are the lasting impacts of this skirmish, James?
$3,000 iPhones. I think there's now Australia finds itself in a really interesting position. It's caught between these two superpowers who are both behaving quite badly. We had the irony of the Chinese ambassador saying that we should hold hands with them and wander off towards the sunshine and the rainbows with a trade, greater trade. And this is, of course, is the country that slapped trade sanctions on our wine, on our agricultural products because they didn't like how we behaved during the pandemic. It's also a country that is sending its warships around the coast at inopportune times. And quite rightly, Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton have been very cautious about endorsing the ambassador's comments. At the same time, US trustworthiness and credibility is not high. The Conservatives in the US have always had a bit of a thing for tariffs. Trump obviously has amplified that out of all proportion. It's a reminder to us that we can't rely on them entirely. So I think for us, we need to look to Asia to a certain extent, while recognising that the alliance with the US, particularly on the security side, is still really important. But I think it's time to really look at building our relationships with countries like Japan, with Korea, with India, with Vietnam, and of course, Indonesia. We have reasonable relationships with these countries already, but I think they're going to become even more important as we try and get a bit of scale as a mid-power caught between two unpredictable superpowers.
Yeah, good point. And then just if you zoom out even further, James, you've got to wonder, how those relationships between Europe and the US are going to go as well. Europe's keen to rearm. Obviously, there's going to be questions about NATO, which has been a core tenet of international security. And from a financial markets perspective, I just wonder whether we're going to see this lingering risk premium on US bonds. If it's going to cost more for the US to borrow. But to be fair to Trump, it was probably going to cost more for them to borrow anyway because their debt situation was getting so ridiculous. So it was already sort of headed down that path for him.
Mate, it always comes back to bonds. It's the 90% of the iceberg.
All right, James, let's stick with Donald Trump for our second topic, but bring him back home closer to us. Donald Trump shapes as almost the third candidate in the Australian election. We had our political leaders, Anthony Albanese, Peter Dutton, Jim Chalmers and Angus Taylor, engaging in pre-election debates this week. But it is Trump, his tariffs, his geopolitical moves who overshadowed their appearances. James, this one's a bit of a funny election campaign. We're now 3 weeks in. It doesn't really feel like either party's getting that much cut through. We're coming into the Easter and Anzac Day long weekends, and it feels like a lot of Australians could wake up in a couple of weeks and realise they're going to have to decide how to vote. Now, James, you watch politics very closely in your job. You used to work in politics too as a young pup. We're going to make you sing for your supper here on the Chook Pod with an election chat. Firstly, give us your high-level view. How's the election shaping up?
Well, first I have to pick you up on something. You forgot the energy debate that also occurred this week.
Sorry?
But very easy thing to do, and let's not mention it again. Trust me, there's no good will come of discussing that. You're absolutely right in that not since 1966, when Lyndon Johnson arrived in Australia on the eve of an election, which is a bit of a cheeky thing to do. Not that Harold Holt, who swept to victory, cared. Has a US president been so influential? You know, we were heading into a cost of living election where we were going to hear a lot from both sides talking about cost of living, and that is still playing out. But Trump is everywhere in this. And one of the things that Anthony Albanese and his colleagues have been able to do is weaponise this idea that Dutton is somehow a Trump-light candidate. Now, to be fair, Dutton left the door open to this in certain ways. He wants to cut the public service. He's dipped his toe into some of the culture wars stuff. It has enabled Labor to try and paint him as a cut-price Trump. Where they've probably had the most success is in healthcare, which amazingly they've kind of made a big election issue, even though stuff like their bulk billing policy, they're really fixing up problems and creakiness in the health system that they helped create, along with previous governments, to be fair. The other thing to remember is a couple of years ago, Dutton would have been thinking about a two-term strategy. Numerically, the coalition requires a uniform swing of just over 5%, and they need to win net 18 seats to secure a majority. That kind of turnaround's happened about 3 times in the last 50 years. So Dutton's sitting there thinking it's probably going to take 2 terms to get back. But what happened in the last year or so, the polls started turning in his favour, and it started looking possible that rather than a Labor win or a hung parliament, he might even be able to get to those 18 seats. So the coalition gets more confident.
So Dutton was in with a sniff, but when did his fortunes change?
We've got to be careful about causation here, Ant, but I think it started with Cyclone Alfred, which played havoc with their carefully managed plans that they have before each campaign, and he wanders off message in a couple of key instances. He starts talking about how he'd like to live at Kirribilli if he was Prime Minister, and he has to reverse his working from home policy because it's turning out not to be popular with women voters, and that's a key concern for the coalition. So we are in, I would say, a situation where the wind is at Anthony Albanese's back. He's feeling a bit more confident. He's had a reasonable campaign. Dutton's stumbled might be too strong a word, but probably not been as strong as people expected. The other key factor to bring us back to the start point, which is Trump, is that the perception or the received wisdom is that in times of great uncertainty, the incumbent will benefit. And that seems to be playing out at the moment.
I wouldn't blame Peter Dutton for wanting to live at Kirribilli, James. That's a fantastic house.
It's not something you say out loud, Ant. It's not.
A great place to live. All right, let's talk about this week's debates, right? Because that's what happened this week. So the first one, Albanese versus Dutton. Like I said, Albanese's had the wind at his back. Did anyone land a knockout blow in that debate? And who would you say even won it?
Nobody landed a knockout blow. I'd defer to our political editor, Phil Curry, who wrote a really good comment piece about this, where he effectively look the audience at the debate was held in Western Sydney. Thought Albo won, and I can see why. But Phil made the point, for the reasons that I outlined before, that because Dutton gave a pretty solid performance in the debate, he was a winner as well. And the hope within the coalition is that reasonable performance in the debate, is puts a bit of momentum back in his campaign and gives him fresh energy. And I think this week we've seen a much stronger Peter Dutton sort of sticking to his lines, really trying to hit those core issues such as their petrol policy, which gives people a bit of relief from the fuel excise, their gas reservation policy, which I think has some hairs on it, but I can see how that could be politically popular, and hammering this cost of living issue. The leaders' debate, I think, is still important. It gives people a chance to see how both potential prime ministers conduct themselves, and I think they both did okay. The other debates, not so much.
Yeah. What I thought was interesting in the leaders' debate, James, was just the questions that come through. Like, the questions were, I'm a truck driver. Why don't you make fuel excise cut permanent? I have uni-age kids. Will their fees go up if we cut international students? I'm a public school teacher. Anything in it for public schools? Like, it's amazing. It's all it just smacks of self-interest. And maybe that's just how everyone's always voted. I don't know, but it just came through in those questions.
People have definitely always voted, for their own interests. And, every year every election campaign, we talk about cost of living being a major issue like it's something new. It's always the issue. There's nothing new about it at all. But there's a few things that make this a little bit different. We haven't had a recession for a very long time. There are young Australians who have not experienced high unemployment. Things like the pandemic have arguably taught the electorate that government spending is the answer to many of their problems. So there's a bit of a paternalism to politics these days. And Michael Reid, our gun economics writer, pointed this out about the Treasurer's debate, that they did not talk at any point about a policy that would leave a group of Australians worse off. And I'm not an expert about running a country, but I think it's impossible to come up with a set of policies that grow the economy, that improve productivity, do all the things we want to do, where everyone all the time is doing better. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions, and that has washed out of our political system completely.
Yeah, absolutely. No pain, no gain. It's a no-brainer, James. Now, we love questions here at the Chanticleer podcast, and we have a question actually relating to something you're talking about just there, James. So let's take it up top this week. It's from Miranda in Docklands, and she says,
Hi, James and Anthony. My name is Miranda, and I'm from the Docklands in Victoria. The federal election is 3 weeks away, and both major bodies are campaigning hard on the cost of living, and appropriately so. But I was just wondering if you thought there was any major policy that was missing from the debate. Thanks. Love the show.
Well, thanks for the question, Miranda. And you probably thought you were getting James Thompson, but even better, you're getting James Chessell on politics.
You've upgraded.
James Chessell. So tell us what's missing.
And what isn't missing, I've got a list here. And,
okay.
And look, we both work for the Australian Financial Review, so we're interested in big, meaty economic topics. So there's a bit of bias here. There's some social issues that we don't cover as much, but I'll stick to our kind of core business. I'll probably start with, and look, these things are touched on in the debates, but my point is they're not touched on in a meaningful way, in a substantial way. And it goes back to my point about a way where you're talking about, tough decisions where there are trade-offs. So I'd start with a debate about meaningful tax reform.
Oof.
Not tax reform that involves tinkering around with personal income tax rates. I'm talking about, should there be changes to the GST? Should there be changes to the way we tax property? Should there be changes to the way we tax investment in this country. Now, the AFR is always going to believe, and rightly so, in free markets, but there are large groups of Australians who receive benefits from the government in the form of taxation and other benefits that are actually quite well off, and the money could be either saved, which would be great. We've got a lot of deficits stretching out into the next decade, or spent elsewhere. The other thing I'd love to see, and I think was missing, was a meaningful debate about public spending, which includes the long-term sustainability of the NDIS.
Yep.
Now, the NDIS overall is a good policy. Everyone would agree on that. But it can't get to the point where it is unsustainable and unwieldy and unaffordable. And because everyone tiptoes around it, or a lot of people tiptoe around it because they don't want to be seen to be criticising the NDIS, it's soaking up a lot of money. And the problem with that is the people who most deserve the proceeds of the NDIS are sometimes missing out. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'd add to my list is a debate about productivity, which, look, we look at our audience data and even at the AFR, people don't want to go deep on productivity. It's a pretty complicated and dry subject, but the idea with an economy is you want to grow the pie. You don't want to just redistribute the pie that remains the same size. If you want to grow the pie, you need to grow it, and you need productive growth. And we are in a productivity recession in this country at the moment. So if we can get if we can improve productivity, then the wage rises people are getting make more sense economically. The immigration that is occurring makes more sense economically, and everyone will be better off, and we'll reach that nirvana where no one has to be worse off.
Yeah, James, productivity is living standards. So productivity rises, living standards rise. Productivity falls, living standards fall. Productivity is falling, living standards are falling. Like it's
exactly.
It's actually it can be really, really simple. But I'm with you, James. I think what's missing is anything to get the economy moving. Basically, go back to the budget. Like you said, the small income tax slightly reducing the rate on the lowest income bracket versus a fuel excise cut to make petrol a bit cheaper. Like, not much in that. It's both are slightly good for the end consumer, but neither really offers anything other than a sort of short-term sugar hit. Neither party's really doing much for the generational divide, the plight of younger people versus older people.
Exactly. Really good point.
Neither's making long-term reform to the tax system, to your point. Neither's doing anything about the NDIS bleeding, also to your point. To me, James, it all comes back to tax, housing, and cheap and reliable energy for business. It's like those three things. Tax, like seriously, it's time for a conversation. The GST's 25 this year.
Yeah, it is actually.
Yeah, it's 25
in
this year.
July, I think.
Yeah, so I think directionally, like I would love to see a proper debate, proper treasury analysis. I think we got to turn the tax system on its head, right? Income tax down, incentive for people to work more, earn more, take that overtime shift. Like don't slug people 45 cents in the dollar for going above and beyond. Problem is that creates a revenue hole. So how do you fix the revenue hole, James? Increase GST, right? You tax consumption. But I would love to see like treasury analysis of how we could move those two levers and what it could do for the economy. Yet the problem is politicians just can't stand up and say that, or they get smashed over their head. And raising the GST sounds really, really scary. But actually, if you did it at the same time as playing around with income tax, it could be really productive for the country. And our problem, James, is of the government's budget, right? So I think the government's total tax receipts this financial year are going to be about $650 billion. 500 of those comes from income tax receipts, right? Most of that is from individuals as well, not from companies. We're so reliant on individual income tax receipts. GST is only $90 billion out of the $650 billion. Like it's not actually that much. I think if we can re-skew it towards the tax on consumption, the GST, it should provide better incentives throughout the economy. It's pretty much just those things that make up the country's revenue. Everything else is rats and mice. You got fuel excise, I think it's $30 billion, but apart from that, all the other taxes at the state level, at least, are lacking. To your point as well about investment, franking credit refunds. Obviously, it's not going to be popular with older Australians. And from a policy perspective, I completely agree with you. I'm just not sure that the fight will be worth it over that one. I don't know whether, it's something that could save Australia maybe $10 billion a year or something, right? Directionally, it's right. But I think we could go even bigger than that, all right, by focusing on the income tax and the GST.
Sounds like a policy platform, and if it is, you have my vote. Look, and I just want to be clear. I wasn't necessarily making an argument to revisit franking credits. I'm making an argument that you need to have trade-offs with this kind of stuff, and you need a combination of policies. And there's a certain group of older Australians that are probably benefiting more than others. So you got to work all that stuff through. But where I completely agree with you is that the burden on income tax payers is really high. All the intelligent people we run in our pages make this argument, and many of them make similar arguments to what you just did about the GST. Where I disagree a tiny bit is the need for more Treasury advice. Like we've had many papers on tax reform in this country. What we need is a bit of political courage to actually implement some new ideas.
All right, lastly, just quickly, James, while you're on the election, who do you think is going to win?
Look, the polls tell us, Ant, that neither side will win. It'll be a hung parliament, and then they'll have to, whoever is in front will probably get first go at negotiating with the independents and the Greens and whoever else. You wouldn't be betting on a majority for either side.
So who will be in government?
Mate, if the week has taught me one thing, it's not a great time to be making predictions. I don't want to be like those guys at Goldman Sachs that had to reverse their recession call after, 73 minutes? 73 minutes. Or our friends at Deutsche Bank who had to change their interest rate call after a couple of days. So, Ant, I'm going to chicken out and not answer that question.
Very wise, James. All right, well, it's time for a break. We'll be back straight afterwards to talk about another big week in Australian business. All right, welcome back. Let's look at what's coming ahead, James. Now, there's a few economic points coming up. So on Wednesday, US time, Thursday morning our time, we have US retail sales, which is interesting, I think, this one, James, because of the uncertainty that all this Trump stuff probably has created around the consumer. We saw consumer spending consumer confidence drop off here, James, around this Trump stuff. Do you reckon we could see it coming through the retail sales in the US?
Yeah, I'd be amazed if it wasn't.
All right, and on Thursday, we have Australian unemployment data. The last read was 4.1%, probably looking at something similar this time around. And James, amid it all, we've got lots of quarterly earnings coming out of the US, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Johnson & Johnson, all the usuals. Do you think it matters for markets?
I think the quarterly earnings won't matter so much. You mentioned Jamie Dimon before. I think the commentary and the way they try and push or nudge Trump in a certain direction will be what matters.
Now, if you want to know more about what we're talking about today and a whole lot more, AFR subscribers can sign up to the Chanticleer newsletter at join.afr.com/Chanticleer. Every Saturday morning, the newsletter pulls together the best Chanticleer columns from the week and delivers them straight to your inbox. Now, we've already had our question, James, but for anyone that wants to send us a question, you can email us at chanticleer@afr.com. You can send us a question in audio form. Just record a voice memo on your phone and include your name and where you are from and email us. All right, James, it's been great to have you in with the podcast this week. A hugely momentous week with Trump, the tariffs, the election coming up. Thank you very much for your time.
Really enjoyed it, Ant. Happy to come back whenever James is on holiday.
All right, we'll see you next week. If you like the podcast and you want to hear more, consider sharing or giving the podcast a review as it helps other listeners find us. And don't forget to follow wherever you get your podcasts. At the Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. For more, go to afr.com and you can subscribe to the Financial Review, the daily habit of successful people, at afr.com/subscribe. Chanticleer was hosted by me, Anthony Macdonald, and James Chessell, and it was produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Our theme is by Alex Gow, head of podcast is Lap Fan, and the head of premium content is Fiona Buffini.
The Australian Financial Review.